Alright, Chapter 3, Cigarettes and an individual social pressure start with you smoking have since played a major role in making you continue, but what are forces inside you? What are they? How do they operate? What is the sinister, magic, unseen, elusive that makes you reach internally for another cigarette even when you're by yourself? There's no doubt that the internal force exists. Your young father, named Fred J., once told smoke watchers of a bad, lonely time he came to face with. I figured out the part of the truth about smoking, he told us. It seemed that the social pressures played a big part. I guess I figured it out. I couldn't get away from everything for a while. It would be easy to give up cigarettes, but I didn't see it as a whole truth. His plan was to go away somewhere in himself for the week. He had heard from his friends who were former smokers the first few days of the quit process are hardest. If you get through 1 week, a businessman colleague had told him, you've got it just about licked. Once a week, 1 week, that's all. Week of misery, and you're free for life. Fred mulled over the long time he tried to quit smoking several times before he found one of the first few days were indeed hard, so hard, in fact, that he had not been able to endure him. Tobacco had defeated him every time on the second day. He began to think of the social pressures noticed that smoked most heavily with a busier day at the office. He was an assistant editor of the small monthly magazine. At bridge games, he was an expert player holding several master points. At parties in general, he had more people junctures of his life thought. People's society tension overpopulated life that what it does, and it just got away with it. Everybody went away with the whole rush and the roar. It would make it, I'll make it. It wasn't just that Fred disliked people that disliked his life. He was no misfit of the 20th century urban America. He found his life thoroughly enjoyable, stimulating, and he was in fact gregarious to a high degree, but he recognized that his smoking had something to do with other people. That was the clue that he seized upon. He had an analytical mind. The trouble was, a little like many other people, most smokers seeking to escape his habit, he didn't carry out any analysis far enough, deep enough, while thinking with his thoughts, but apparently he had opportunity suddenly arose to put his thoughts to the test. Managing editor to his magazine asked him to tackle a special editing assignment, take all the next week to do it. The managing editor said, take your phone off the hook and lock yourself up in some place with a job. You can do it at home if you want. Just show up the next Friday with the job done. This was Fred talked with the matter over and over with his wife, who was a non-smoker who had long been gently urging Fred to quit. They owned a small summer cabin on the lake a 3 hours drive away. At the seat of the mid-autumn lake was virtually desert. The cabin had an electrical heater that would warm a special space adequately unless the fall days suddenly turned into winter cold, which was not likely. Fred and his wife decided that he would spend the week at the cabin with his editing job without his cigarettes. Before he started the long drive, he stood next to his car and smoked a cigarette, thinking this will be the last one. On the second thought, he decided it would be the next to last one. The long drive was boring and fatiguing. He had long been habit smoking in the cars. To leave boredom, he told himself to keep it awake. He decided that he would smoke one cigarette halfway to the point of the route. He emptied all the one cigarettes from his pack and threw all the others away. He didn't enjoy the drive. He couldn't wait until he reached the halfway mark. When he had driven about a third way, he thought, why torture myself with smoking a cigarette? Then it seemed easier to do that way. From here on, he told himself the only willpower required would be that not pulling into a gas station to buy more cigarettes. He made it to the cabin just at dusk as falling, and he brewed himself some coffee, sipped it, and looked out over the lonesome lake. Not a one human being was in sight. Calm water reflected magnificent in pink and purple sky. The only sound Fred could hear was the hush-push whisper of the breeze and great hemlocks that surrounded the cabin. I don't think I'd ever known such tranquility, Fred recalled later. Perfect peace somewhere out there in the world, melting along, people running through trains, drinking, jabbering at each other, worrying and smoking. But I was all alone, no pressure, no cigarettes, and felt enormously exhilarated, brimming of the new confidence why I didn't even want a cigarette he was going to make. He was at bed early and arose early the next morning. He missed cigarettes that wasn't there with the morning coffee. He thought, well, the day's first drag was always the best. I won't miss the others so much. Unfortunately, he did. He sat down on the table to be in the edit work, and after a quarter of an hour, he had stand up, go outside, walk among the hemlocks. He wanted a cigarette badly. He thought, I've got to stop thinking about cigarettes. He sat down over the table again, determined to concentrate with the whole energy of his mind on the work. For a while, he was successful. He became absorbed on the job. He worked steadily for nearly an hour. Then, coming to a stopping point, he leaned back in the chair and automatically reached into his shirt pocket for a cigarette. He jolted back to reality. The work went very slowly for the rest of the day. 2 frequent breaks, once walking around the lake distance for 4 miles. He went back to bed early again. The only time quitting doesn't bother you, he thought, is when you're asleep. Next morning, he got up and drank a cup of coffee and didn't enjoy it. He thought about all the work he should have done the day before, the job had to be finished by Friday. He could possibly finish with a miserable, nervous state. He climbed into his car, drove to the nearest gas station, bought a pack of cigarettes, and in his addition to physical addiction, something like a hook of the hard narcotics. Doctors don't quite agree to this point. Some believe that there's a physical additive property even in nicotine or some other, perhaps yet undiscovered ingredient inhaled in tobacco smoke. Others say the entire problem is psychological in nature, no physical. In any case, the argument is neither very heated nor very important. All the doctors agree that if there are physical addictive components, action of smoking of the human mind and body, physical component is extremely weak. As a matter of fact, the medical men don't even agree on the definition of addiction. Generally, however, the thoroughgoing physical addiction is usually thought of as having 2 main characteristics. The addicted needs to even ever larger dose of the addiction substance in order to satisfy the craving. Thus, the heroin addicted may begin injecting minor doses into the buttocks or arm muscle and end up pumping massive doses of the femoral artery main lining, as it's called, progresses from 1 fix a week to 1 or more a day. Terminal conditions begin being one in which he must maintain a certain concentration of the drug in the order system. His system all day, injecting each new dose before the old one's effects have worn off. He may need so much of the drug, he ultimately drugs himself to death. Similarly, alcoholics begins with getting drunk with a random occasion regularly with at least once of the day, finally all day. Cigarette smoking exhibits the ever more characteristics to some extent, but not uncommonly to serve the extent. Typical smokers throughout his life menders up and down through heavier smoke to lighter smoking. He may smoke a lot 1 week or 1 day less the next week. This is apparently not fixed to the rising minimum concentration chemical substance that the body requires him to maintain. The addict suffers severe illness, even the death, that he stops supplying the body with addicting substance, in other words, becomes inextractable, tangled with his body chemistry that his body requires physically. No such severe withdrawal systems have ever been observed in anybody who stops smoking. They certainly physical withdrawal system is true, we'll discuss later, but they are so mild that they can be called anything worse than irritating. They are less painful and cold and mild, causing poison ivy even for the heaviest smoker. Thus, physical addiction is only a very minor part of smoking complex. For all practical purposes, you can forget about. Doctors have experienced various chemicals to help smokers quit, and the result of the experience showed without expectation that the most of you expect with the anti-smoking drug is very temporary and very mild kind of help. For example, nicotine is one of the active ingredients in tobacco. Doctors have tried giving smokers this chemical by pill or injection. Experimenters hope to might alleviate or lessen the dull of tobacco craving, saturating smoking by an active drug formerly obtained by inhaling. The idea promised fitting unfortunately doesn't work. In paper and subject, Dr. Borgi Erdrup of the New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center recently reported nicotine does not give any pleasurable effect to itself. It is emetic. In excess of produce nausea. Neither of the other chemicals tobacco give pleasure themselves. There are pleasurable effects, in other words, comes from the act of smoking, but not from the chemical change of the produced in the body, but the ingredients for the smoke, but the exactly opposite of the situation obtained such for the drug of the heroin. Heroin uses the drug with an injection into itself, the act of an injection non-pleasurable. In fact, it can be actually painful, and if the needle is dull or the body is bruised or inflamed by too many of the previous injections. In the case if the user gets its pleasure from a chemical change that take place in the body after the injection. Unlike smoker habit, the heroin user habit is based on physical addiction.